The best kind of horror is always the kind of horror that you don't see coming. Today, my friends, I have a story for you. A disturbing tale of terror, of morbid fantasy, and of fetish persistence. A story that comes with a unique twist. Central Medical University is a lab that is full of potential young students who are seeking their education within the fields of medical research. It is expected upon each and every medical student within this class to memorize every single detail of the human body. And what better way to learn than to have an hands-on experience? Working in a group and working together at a pace of 3 months, enough time to have all the bodies dissected. But before the learning experience, it is also expected upon each student to share a moment of silence for the precious specimens that were donated in the name of science. And just as the moment had came, where the order was given to have the bodies taken out and prepared for dissection, Tatsuro Kamata was a bit surprised over his specimen. She was young, attractive, but her complexion was a bit too good. It was almost like she was still alive. But what Tatsuro found to be more shocking, besides the unbearable feeling that he had somehow known this girl, is that even though nobody else saw it, he could have sworn that this body had blinked. It was absurd, an unthinkable idea that this body was still alive, until Tatsuro had touched the body and was overwhelmed with a disturbing sense of terror when realizing that the specimen was still warm. And just as the ruckus had captured the professor's attention, who found the idea of one of the specimens being alive as outlandish, a sick joke among the students that would be dealt with harshly, the professor had also found that this examination with the body was that not only was this body warm, but her skin looked nothing like the others that were soaked in formalin. And that was when the body smiled. The professor, who was outraged with the possibility of this being a sick joke. The woman was not only alive, but her explanation for being mixed up with the other bodies had given the professor and the other students a terrifying, a disturbing reaction. At first, it just seemed like it was still a joke when this woman said that she wanted to be dissected, but when she had begun screaming her insistence of being cut open immediately, that was when the professor and the classmates had begun realizing that this disturbing moment was far more serious than a sick joke. And just as someone was about to call the authorities, that was when this disturbing woman had quickly ran out the lab and disappeared. So a couple days later, the girl who wanted to be dissected had become the center topic amongst the students. As it turned out, for quite some time, the girl had also been visiting other dissection labs and hospitals as a corpse, with the bizarre intent of being dissected. There had even been rumors that she would be lurking the corner of the streets, asking random strangers to cut her open. Such horrible gossip. Kind of makes you think of how the world would have sick-minded perverts. But for Tatsuro, his mind was on something else, especially over the fact that he had known this girl. And if he's not mistaken, her name should be Tamiya Ruriko. And dwelling upon the horrid memories of the past was enough to convince Tatsuro that this girl is indeed Tamiya. Even though she was a bit strange, Tatsuro had considered Tamiya as a close friend. It all began innocently when Tamiya had found this strange fascination with Tatsuro wanting to grow up be a doctor like his father. And like other kids, she and Tatsuro used to have fun playing doctor and patient. But then her innocent behavior had begun to turn into a morbid curiosity when Tamiya had wanted to play doctor with the scalpel. Maybe it was because of how Tatsuro had a crush on Tamiya, or maybe it was because he was young and gullible. But let's just say that stealing his father's scalpel had become something that he will forever regret. Tamiya's fascination with the scalpel was bizarre, uncomfortable for Tatsuro, especially when she pulled out a live frog. Every time he dwells on memories like this, the horrible things he did with Tamiya, Tetsuro always told himself that he was just a kid experimenting, just a kid who didn't know what the hell he was doing. But seeing Tamiya cutting the frog while he was holding down the poor animal, Tetsuro had not only felt sick but felt horrible inside, especially when he would notice Tamiya's fascination. He didn't want any of this. If there ever was one thing that Tetsuro wanted to understand about his past, is why he had followed Tamiya in her morbid interest after the frog. Of course, there were more, and like a good friend, Tetsuro was pressured into helping Tamiya perform such horrid acts, remembering every small animal he had held down. Well, eventually, rumors began to spread throughout school when a couple kids found out what Tetsuro and Tamiya were doing. Constantly, kids would make fun of Tetsuro and his strange girlfriend, calling her Dissection Girl, and as expected, they would give Tetsuro the nickname Dissection Boy. But on one day, Tamiya's twisted experiments had finally reached its limitations for Tetsuro when Tamiya had wanted to dissect larger animals like cats and dogs. And as Tetsuro refused to join Tamiya's sick-minded fantasies on tormenting any more helpless creatures, that he just couldn't do it. He wanted no part of it. And as a good friend, he had even tried convincing Tamiya to put an end to this madness. That was when Tamiya had begun focusing her twisted fascination onto Tetsuro, expressing an overwhelming sense of excitement when saying that it would be thrilling to dissect her closest friend. In fact, she would rather move past cats and dogs and immediately focus on something bigger, like Tetsuro. And out of fear and terror, that was when Tetsuro began running for his life, while being chased by Tamiya, who was wielding his father's scalpel. Now, even though this was the last time Tetsuro had saw Tamiya before he and his family had instantly moved to another city, Tetsuro did remember hearing Tamiya crying for his help, as if she were in pain, which of course he did ignore. So who knew that years later Tetsuro would meet Tamiya under such circumstances? After all those years doing Lord knows what, that Tamiya's twisted thinking had somehow escalated with the fantasy of wanting to be surgically dissected. God, it was wrong. It was sick. Even though she didn't seem to recognize Tetsuro on that day, he couldn't even help himself from dwelling on the strong possibility of a reunion between himself and Tamiya. Dwelling on that grim possibility of Tamiya seeking to fulfill her original intent of having Tetsuro dissected. Poor Tetsuro, troubled and lost in his own thoughts, not even realizing that within the shadows, he was being stalked by a familiar face. And just as Tetsuro had felt that small sense of fear, a sixth sense if you want to call it, and there she was, behind a tree. And at that very moment when Tamiya did not hesitate on requesting to be dissected by this young and handsome medical student, that was when Tetsuro had ran. When Tetsuro had finally made it home, realizing that may have been the fastest he had ever ran in his life, he was more afraid of the fact that Tamiya had known he was a medical student, but she didn't recognize him. It didn't seem like it, thankfully. But then again, maybe she did. Tetsuro, of all people, should know that it's not hard to forget a familiar face these days. Regardless of how fast Tetsuro had ran home, somehow, Tamiya had broken into his house when also experiencing such a familiar face herself. She just couldn't resist such a beautiful, grand moment of being reunited with a special friend, to seek forgiveness for the cruelty she had put Tetsuro through during those young years, to grant forgiveness for Tetsuro's abandonment during a time of need, to explain her sickness and internal pain within her stomach that had driven her into dissecting more and more animals after that horrible day. And as she embraced this sickened fantasy upon others, driving her into performing such horrible things. Eventually, the sickness had driven her into wanting to reach the ultimate high, to reach an experience that is far greater than dissecting others, which is to be dissected herself. How thrilling would it be, how romantic, to be cut up by your first crush, who is now a medical student, with such medical experience, with precision hands. The dissection could last for hours without fatal consequences. And what better instrument to use to cut with than a father's stolen scalpel? And as Tetsuro stood before Tamiya, frozen with disbelief and terror, that was when it happened. The fetish fantasy had begun to turn into a supernatural reality when her stomach had begun to twist and turn. Tetsuro could easily tell that Tamiya was experiencing intense pain, and yet she didn't seem to care for the violent movement within her body, laughing hysterically while begging to be cut open. Whatever Tetsuro saw that day had driven him to the point where he was entirely convinced that this reunion with Tamiya was nothing more but a dream, a nightmare. That's all it was, his imagination getting the better of him. And yes, even though that was the last time Tetsuro had saw Tamiya Ruriko, moving on from such a traumatic event wasn't that easy for him, trying to move forward and dwell on the thing he had saw, still trying to tell himself that it was just a nightmare, a dream gone bad, his imagination getting the better of him. But when one of Tetsuro's medical classmates began mentioning of a strange post he found last night that was found on this dating website, it was a girl seeking a man who could dissect her perfectly. Maybe it was because of the anxiety, the stress, the fear that had driven Tetsuro to the point of exhaustion, just enough to faint on such bizarre news as this madness continues on. How far will it go before somebody finally puts a stop to this sickened fetish? How far does it have to go before somebody finally gets hurt or even killed? Well, eventually, my friends, when that day had finally came, when that fetish had gone too far, it was the kind of news that had made it to the media and had shocked the country. It began as a basic and blunt headline: "Woman assaulted by a man with a sharp object." Even though the culprit had confessed to the crime, he also turned it into a bizarre story when mentioning that the victim had insisted to be cut open. And as the investigation had begun focusing on the woman who was severely injured and her history of breaking into several surgical labs with the intent of being dissected, that was when this unknown female had escaped from the hospital shortly after she had gone through surgery for her fatal injuries. And as time had progressed and the media had begun to move on from this bizarre story, that was when the rumors had begun to spread. Supposedly the culprit, the one who dissected this girl, as it turns out, he went mad, as with those who had operated on her. And even though many had found these rumors as just baseless stories, that they were heavily exaggerated, Tetsuro had assumed that the incident was enough to put Tamiya's madness to an end, that her bizarre fetish had finally taught her a lesson, that it's a miracle that she is still even alive, that such a fatal and painful experience, there's just no way Tamiya would be willing to have somebody cut her again, right? I mean, is it still possible that there would be another day where Tamiya would step back into Tetsuro's life like a nightmare? I mean, had she truly learned her lesson, or was it only the beginning? It had been 20 years since Tetsuro Kamata and the world had moved on from Tamiya and her sick fetish. Now that Tetsuro's dreams of being a doctor had gotten him the respectful position as an instructor among medical students, now honored and recognized as Professor Kamata, little did Tetsuro know that a shocking discovery found on one of the donated specimens would revive those old and horrible memories, that were hidden in the back of his mind. The entire body was mapped with a history of scars and stitches, showing a long and painful story of surgical procedures gone horribly wrong. It was like reading a cruel battle with illness and pain. And even though the body of this woman had aged and was badly damaged, Tetsuro knew. He knew that this was Tamiya Ruriko. It was another reunion among close friends. That after all these years, her sick fetish and threatening innocent people to fulfill her twisted fantasy had finally came to its fatal conclusion. But of course, we should know that a story like this would have more than just some blunt ending. We know that a man's denial of accepting the bizarre and the supernatural will come with its own surprises. Like when Tamiya's body had been dissected, opened up, the gruesome discoveries that awaited inside the anatomy of Tamiya Ruriko. Well, my friends, let's just say that when Tetsuro had finally saw the squirming movement, the fur, and the living organs reaching out for the open world, that was when an old nightmare had become a reality. And even though nobody had noticed it, nor even questioned the possibility for obvious reasons, it was also the moment when Tamiya had finally been given her greatest and most thrilling experience. Well, my friends, even though that was quite the morbid story, I do thank you for watching today's episode. If you're curious as to what stories I'll be doing next, or you just want to be friends, then you can find me on Twitter with the link in the description below. Anyways, please feel free for any questions, comments, or any found corrections. Until next episode, thank you for watching The Horror Show.